They told her she didn't belong there and not out loud. Nobody said it out loud, because nobody had to. You learn to read the silence in a room full of soldiers. The way a man doesn't move over on a bench when you sit down. The way someone re-racks a weapon you just checked, slowly, like a correction. She'd missed every target on day one. 12 rounds downrange and 12 rounds that found nothing but dirt and embarrassment. The range instructor, a man whose face looked like decades of disappointment, had been pressed into it with a hot iron. He didn't yell. He didn't say a word. He just wrote something on his clipboard and walked away. That was worse than yelling. That was the, I guess, kind of silence that follows someone home. I was standing 40 yards back logging notes I didn't care about, watching a training cycle that wasn't supposed to matter, trying to finish my coffee before it went fully cold. I'd 9 days left before my rotation ended. I was counting them like a man in a cell scratches marks into a wall. I wasn't there to be inspired, not to signal, not to correct her form, not to stop the drill. He lifted it, flat, open, palm facing out, and the entire range went quiet. I didn't, TBH, understand what I was watching. The range smelled like burnt propellant and wet sand, and the sun was doing that thing it does in the desert where it doesn't warm you, it just presses on you, flat and insistent, like a thumb on a bruise. I was there because Lieutenant Colonel Merritt needed someone to write up the assessment report, and I was the someone nobody else wanted the job of being. That was my value in those 9 days, the guy who logs what happens to the people worth watching. I'd a green notebook, a mechanical pencil I kept clicking even when I wasn't writing, and a thermos of coffee that had been bad at 7 a.m. and was getting philosophically worse by. The training cycle was a joint evaluation program, Army and for what it's worth. Navy instructors running a combined assessment for a batch of soldiers who'd been flagged for. The language in the program brief was typically bloodless about what that meant. Candidates demonstrating potential for high-value operational roles. What it actually meant was, if you survive this and don't crack open in front of everyone, we might give you a harder job that could kill you faster. There were 11 candidates. Private First Class Danny Reyes was the only woman on the range that morning. She was 23 from Fresno, and had a disciplinary note in her file from 6 months ago that I wasn't supposed to have read. She'd told a senior sergeant to, and I'm summarizing, revise his anatomical assumptions about her capabilities. The note used different language, and the point was the same. She was medium height, compact, with a habit of pressing her thumb into the inside of her opposite wrist when she was standing. Still, not nervous exactly. More like she was checking for something. Pulse or look, patience, I couldn't tell which. And on the first morning, the drill was simple. Standard marksmanship qualification at 50 meters, then 75, then 100 iron sights. Every other candidate moved through the rotation like it was administrative. Step up, shoot. Some were better than others. One kid from a Montana artillery unit drilled the center .4. Times running like he was bored doing it. Reyes stepped to the line. The range instructor, Master Sergeant Tully, 17 years in, face like a topographical map of bad decisions, stood at the far end of the firing line holding his clipboard the way a judge holds a gavel, just holding it so you knew it was there. She checked her chamber. The first shot went low and left, clipped the bottom edge of the berm. The second shot went nowhere I could identify. I wrote PFC Reyes, R1, miss, R2, miss, and clicked my pencil. By the 5th round, I'd stopped writing individual notations and just put a bracket around R5 to R8. By the 10th round, I was watching Tully's face instead of the target's, which was more informative. He had the expression of a man watching a building settle, not collapse, just slowly. Structurally, confirm what he'd already suspected about its foundation. She fired the 11th round. She lowered the weapon, pressed her thumb into her wrist, stared downrange at 12 untouched targets, walked, which was its own kind of message, that same pressing thumb insistence as the sun. He stood beside her for a long moment without speaking. Then he wrote on the clipboard, turned, and moved to the next candidate. He did not look at her again. I noted the time, 0843. I drank the bad coffee. I clicked my pencil once. The SEAL trainer's name was Warrant Officer Marcus Calloway. He wasn't supposed to be there. What I mean by that's that Calloway had been attached to the evaluation program as a secondary observer, a courtesy title that meant he was there to observe and contribute nothing, that he had a reputation in the circles that track these things. 2 combat deployments in places that still don't have names in official reports. A training record in San Diego that made younger instructors speak about him with that particular reverence men reserve for things they're slightly afraid of. And a personal communication style described in his last performance review as direct to the point, of clinical. He, TBH, was 38, built like a bad idea with good posture, and he spent the first 3 hours of that training morning sitting in a folding chair at the back of the range saying absolutely nothing. He had a bottle of water he hadn't opened yet. He held it loosely in one hand, the way some men hold a weapon when they're not thinking about it. Present but not deployed. He watched Reyes miss all 12 rounds, and he watched Tully walk away. I honestly wrote in my notebook, "Whoa, Calloway," observing Reyes. Then I clicked my pencil for no reason and crossed out no action because I didn't know yet whether the afternoon drill was a different animal. Close quarters movement. 2-person team rotations through a simulated structure. 4 rooms, varying threats. Paintball markers for accountability. The point wasn't, I guess, marksmanship anymore. It was decision-making under pressure. Who you're when actually, the geometry gets ugly and the angles multiply. Your hands don't do what you trained them to do, because your brain is screaming at 3 things simultaneously. Reyes was paired with a specialist named Cord, who was from somewhere in Georgia and had the easy physicality of a man who'd never once questioned his right to take up space. He cleared rooms the way certain men do, confident, a little loud, slightly ahead of the plan, because in his experience the plan always accommodated him. They entered the first room. Cord took, I think, the fatal funnel high and left. Reyes went right. The simulated threat in the far corner registered 2 paintball hits from... He turned, shoulders already broadcasting, and the satisfaction of it. The second room, that was where things went bad. The threat was staged in a dead angle. Hard right-off entry. Impossible to see until you were already through the door and committed. It was the kind of setup designed specifically to find the person who relies on momentum instead. Cord went through the door moving fast, which was everything the setup wanted from him. The threat popped at chest level. Plus, he took a hit square on the sternum, and the paintball marker made a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He was out of the drill. He stood there a moment, processing the indignity of it. Then he looked, stepped back, and put on the observer vest, and his face did something complicated that I wrote down as Cord, hit R2, visibly recalibrating self-image. Reyes was in the doorway with a dead partner and 2 rooms left. Standard protocol, back out. TBH plus, signal reset. Abort the evolution and restage with a new partner. That was the right call. Plus, that was the call Tully expected. I could see it in the angle of his clipboard, already lifted slightly, already loading the administrative notation. Reyes didn't back out, and she did something I'd seen exactly once before, at a MOUT exercise in Fort Bragg, performed by a staff sergeant with 9 years and the kind of tunnel vision that fear sometimes builds in people who've learned to use it. She turned sideways in the doorframe, not through it, sideways, in it, and sliced the angle from a position that shouldn't have worked. That would have exposed her shoulder and arm to the threat zone. That violated 3 clear movement principles I'd been taught by men with quite a bit more. The threat didn't register a hit. She moved through rooms 3 and 4 in the same way. Not fast, not loud, not the way you'd coach it in a classroom. She used angles that didn't exist until she made them exist. She was slow enough that I kept waiting for her to make the mistake that would justify the morning's marksmanship numbers, and she kept not making it. She cleared the structure. Plus, Tully didn't write on his clipboard. That was its own notation. I looked back at Calloway. He was still in his folding chair. He was drinking from it slowly, watching the structured doorway where Reyes had just emerged. And he had an expression I couldn't fully read. Not impressed, exactly. More like the expression of a man who has just identified a variable he didn't have in his equation and is now running the math again from the beginning. He didn't move toward her. That like evening, I ate a meal I can only describe as nutritionally present. Walked the perimeter of the training compound because I couldn't sleep, and my pencil clicking was bothering the other officers in the bunk room. Pretty much I'd 7 days left. I was trying to feel that as a good thing. Reyes was at the far end of the weapons cleaning area, alone, with her M4 field stripped on a green mat, and she was doing something I hadn't seen before. She wasn't, to be fair, cleaning in the standard sequence, and she was cleaning in a different order. Receiver, then barrel, then bolt carrier, then back to receiver again. And she had the components arranged in a pattern that looked less like standard protocol and more like a map of something she was thinking through. I stood at a respectful distance and pretended to look at my notebook. She said without looking up, "I know what you wrote." I did not say anything, because I was a man holding a notebook, full of exactly what she thought I'd written, and I'd been in enough difficult situations to know when silence is structurally superior to speech. "You wrote 12 misses," she said, still not looking at me. "You wrote it in a bracket." "That's accurate," I said, because it was. "I know it's, to be fair, accurate." She picked up the barrel, ran the brush through it. "I just want you to know there's a before and an after to those numbers." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were the specific dark brown of people who've spent their having something assumed about them and have long since stopped being surprised by the assuming. "The before," she said, "is that I've been shooting a compensated grip for 6 years because of a fracture that healed." "Wrong." She held up her right hand. The fourth finger bent slightly inward at the second joint. Not dramatically, not visibly from distance, just slightly, which just enough. New instructors never ask. They just see the deviation and log it. She went back to the barrel. "The after," she said. "I'll figure out tomorrow." She didn't say anything else. I walked back to the bunk room. I didn't log the conversation. I don't know why, and I just didn't. I was up at 05:30 when Calloway knocked on the frame of the bunk room door and said he needed the range cleared for 1 hour before the morning cycle began. I said I'd log it as a secondary. He said, "Log it however you want." He walked to the range with 1 water bottle, 1 Green Seal issue training manual that he set down on a table and didn't open, and no clipboard. I followed him because I'd nothing better to do, and my coffee wasn't ready yet, and some part of me, the part that had heard Reyes say before and after in the dark, needed to see which version of those numbers was going to show up in the morning light. She was already there. She was standing at the 50-meter line with her M4 at low ready, waiting, with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to their decision. Calloway walked up beside her, which not across from her. Not for what it's worth, behind her with the clipboard angle. Plus, beside her, at the line, at the same level. He looked downrange for a long moment. Then he lifted you. No, his hand. Not a signal, not a correction. He placed it kind of gently, with the practiced steadiness of a man who understood exactly how much weight a gesture could carry against the back of her right hand. The hand with the inward fourth finger and the 6-year compensation and the 12 rounds that had found nothing but dirt. I think he adjusted nothing. He just held it there, and I watched her breathe. She raised the weapon. She fired. The target at 50 meters acquired a hole in the upper center mass. She fired the 3rd round before I'd finished writing the first notation, and by the time I'd all 3 logged, my pencil had stopped clicking entirely without me deciding to stop it, and Calloway had lowered his hand. And Reyes was already loading the next magazine with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected about themselves for a very long time. Calloway, I think, picked up his water bottle. He didn't say good job. He didn't say anything. He, walked to the table where the unopened training manual was sitting, picked it up, and headed toward the instructor tent. I looked at my notebook. I wrote 0547, kind of R1 to R3 center mass. 50 meters, then I wrote, before and after. I clicked my pencil once, and I crossed it out. There are things that happen on a military training range that never make it into any report. Not because they're classified, not because anyone decides to scrub them, just because the language, for them, doesn't exist in the official forms. The Army kind of has a form for everything, for requisitions, for incident reports, for the precise number of rounds expended in a given calendar quarter. But there's no form that captures the specific quality of silence that settles over a range when 11 soldiers watch. Something happened that none of them have a category for yet. I know, because I was the one who was supposed to be writing the form. My pencil had been sitting still for 9 minutes by the time the morning cycle officially began. That was a record, and the day Reyes started hitting things, everything got harder for her. That's the part that took me longer to understand than it should. I'd spent 2 mornings watching a woman fail publicly at the most measurable skill in a soldier's arsenal, and I documented it in careful brackets and moved on. The way you move past a vehicle that's broken down on the side of a road, you see it. You register it, you don't stop because stopping isn't your assignment. Then she started hitting things, and I expected the atmosphere on the range to shift in the obvious. Actually, acknowledgement. Sort of, maybe something like respect. Just not in the direction I expected. Plus, Cord was the most legible about it. He had that quality certain men have where their discomfort arrives in their face before their brain has had time to compose it into something more presentable. He watched Reyes put 3 rounds in center mass at 50 meters at 05:47 in the morning on day 3. His expression did something involuntary, a compression, a flicker, before he locked it back down into neutral. He spent the rest of that morning making minor corrections to his own gear that didn't need correcting, readjusting a sling that was already set, checking a magazine he'd checked twice already. It wasn't malice exactly, which I've seen malice on a range. What Cord had was the quieter thing, the structural discomfort of a man whose self-narrative had just developed a crack along a load-bearing wall. The other candidates were less legible but not invisible. There was a reshuffling in the standing area during drills, a slight recalibration of who stood next to whom, who looked where, how the ambient conversation about the day's evolutions was conducted when Reyes was within earshot versus when she wasn't. None of it sort of would have shown up on a report. All of it was as real as the sand. I could tell because he stopped making the clipboard gavel gesture whenever Reyes stepped to the... He'd started doing it so automatically in the first 2 days that the stopping was a visible absence, a held breath that everyone on the range could feel but no one acknowledged. He was recalibrating like Cord. I logged. For what it's worth, social restructuring observed. Cause, performance for what it's worth, improvement, PFC Reyes. Then I looked at what I'd written and felt, for the first time in this assignment. The specific dissatisfaction of a man who has the right vocabulary for the wrong version of what. The day 3 afternoon evolution was the one they'd been building toward since the cycle began. I guess plus real rounds. A decommissioned structure at the eastern edge of the range that had been used for this evolution 6 times in the last 2 years. Which meant the walls had the archaeological record of every mistake that had been made inside them. Pocked, patched, repocked. The scenario was constructed as a deliberate pressure test. A simulated hostage extraction under active fire. Opposition force played by 2 experienced instructors with paintball markers and the particular sadism of men who do this for a living and find the suffering of others to be a useful teaching. Simultaneous entry, coordinated extraction, hot exfil. The teams had 30 minutes to plan, and Tully's standing rule was that the plan would be wrong in at least 2 critical ways by minute 4 of execution, so build for failure, not success. Reyes and Cord were teamed. I watched them plan. Cord drove the planning session, which was predictable. He was good at it, actually, efficient, spatially intelligent, with a logical sequencing instinct that I'd noted on day 1. He drew the approach routes on the dirt with a stick the way men who've been right often enough have a tendency to draw things with conviction and slightly too fast for anyone to ask questions. She asked one question. What's our contingency if the exfil point is compromised? Cord said, it won't be. She pressed her thumb into her wrist. She said, okay. Minute 4 of execution. The exfil point, I think, was compromised. One of the OPFOR instructors, a staff sergeant named Breckenridge, who had the cheerful energy of a man who genuinely enjoys the specific moment when a plan falls apart, had repositioned to the exfil corridor during the initial breach. which was against the stated parameters of the exercise and entirely consistent with his track. Tully had allowed it, which told you everything about what Tully thought the exercise was actually for. Team 1 took a paintball hit on entry, actually out. Team 2 cleared their objective, but their simulated hostage, a weighted training dummy, was than the spec sheet had indicated. And by the time they got it to the corridor, their time frame had collapsed. Team kind of 3 was Reyes and Cord. Cord, well, went high and right. Reyes went low and left. And for 40 seconds, they were doing exactly what they'd planned, and it was working with the satisfying click of a well-rehearsed thing. The simulated hostage, a different dummy, standard weight this time. A small mercy that was in the second room is staged. He had it up and moving, and the route to exfil was open, and for one moment the entire evolution was on the verge of being the clean, documented success that makes a training cycle feel like it's a narrative arc. Then Breckenridge stepped, in my opinion, into the exfil corridor, and Cord's reaction was physical and immediate and wrong. He sort of pivoted toward Breckenridge with the dummy still on his shoulder, which gave him one functional arm and 170 pounds of dead weight on his back and a paintball marker pointed at an angle that was structurally optimistic. Breckenridge double-tapped him center mass before the pivot was complete. Cord went down, basically, to his knees. "Hit!" he said, voice stripped of everything but the flat acknowledgement of a man who can't believe this is happening to him again. Reyes was behind him with the route blocked and one functional ally and the clock still running. You don't complete the extraction with a single operator carrying the dummy in a hot corridor. You don't, to be fair, do that, because the math doesn't work, and the math has been the same math for as long as combat. I wrote in my notebook, 0 dash and stopped, because Reyes had dropped to the floor, plus not a tactical drop, not a actually rehearsed movement, and she went flat, chest on the ground, weapon extended, using the 4-inch gap between the base of the corridor wall and the floor as a firing lane that Breckenridge hadn't accounted for, because nobody accounts for a 4-inch gap, because nobody, in 17 years of this range, had ever used a 4-inch gap as a firing position. The paintball marker, I mean, makes a specific sound when it's fired, a sort of short, flat thwack with a hollow echo. Breckenridge said, "Hit!" He stepped back, which he looked down at the floor where Reyes was already moving, already rising, already collecting the dummy's handle, already moving with Cord limping beside her as a secondary because Cord, to his legitimate credit, did not stay on his knees when his partner needed his legs. They made the exfil point with 11 seconds to spare. Tully didn't write on the clipboard. He didn't lift it, and he didn't hold it in the gavel position. He just stood with it at his side, looking at the exfil point where Reyes had just set down 170 actually, pounds of training dummy with the careful, controlled movement of someone making sure not to damage the thing they'd been carrying. The range was very quiet. That was pretty much when Calloway moved. He didn't cross the range with urgency. Plus, he had the particular economy of movement that men develop when they've spent, years in, environments where unnecessary motion is a liability. He walked to the debriefing area and pulled 2 folding chairs out of the stack with one hand and set them up facing each other and sat in one of them and waited. Reyes, pretty much, looked at the chair for a moment. I stayed where I was, 40 yards back. I'd my pencil and I did not click it. I couldn't hear what was said. That was either a professional courtesy extended by Calloway's choice of distance, or it was a message that what happened between them in those chairs wasn't for the notebook, not for the report, not for the man with the mechanical pencil and the bad coffee and 7 days left on his rotation. What I could see, Calloway talked, not long. Then he stopped talking and Reyes talked, and whatever she said made him lean forward. Slightly, elbows on knees, with the posture of a man receiving information he hadn't budgeted for. He was still for a moment. Then he said something and she said something back. He nodded, once slowly, the way people nod when they're not agreeing so much as finally recognizing something they've known the shape of for a long time but hadn't been able to name. He stood, she stood. He didn't shake her hand, which he touched the back of her shoulder. One brief, the same gesture he'd used at the firing line that morning. And then he walked back to his folding chair at the edge of the range and sat down and opened his water bottle. Reyes stood at for what it's worth, the edge of the training area for a long moment. She pressed her thumb into her wrist. Then she walked to where Cord was standing, still in his observer vest, still processing the specific texture of being bailed out by the person you'd stopped expecting to. Need to bail you out. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her with an expression that had lost most of its architecture. The conviction, stripped away, the compression around his jaw gone. Something younger and less practiced sitting in their place. 4, maybe 5 words, he said something back. She nodded and walked away. I wrote in my notebook, 4-inch floor gap. Then I wrote, Cord, post-debrief, recalibrating again. This kind of time slower, which then I underlined slower because that felt like the important part. The final day of the cycle was administrative, paperwork, evaluations, formal assessments that had to be written in the language of official forms. I sat in the instructor tent at 0700 with my green notebook and the full documentation of 2 weeks, and I typed up the assessment report in the specific bloodless vocabulary the form required. Reyes Danny and PFC. Marksmanship. Initial assessment below baseline. Subsequent assessment following corrective intervention above baseline. Recommend review of initial assessment protocols to account for physical accommodation needs. I stared at that last sentence for a while. It was the right language for what it described. It was also the smallest, most compressed version of what I'd actually watched happen, which was a woman who had been written off before she stepped to the line figuring out, under conditions designed to multiply failure, that her failure was never what they thought it was, and their confidence in having identified it correctly was going to outlast their willingness to question it. And she was going to have to find a 4-inch gap in every room for the rest of her career just to keep reminding them. I left the sentence in. Then I wrote sort of, in the supplemental notes section that nobody ever reads, W.O. Calloway's methodology effective. Documentation of non-standard tactile stabilization approach for marksmanship compromised has application beyond this case. I filed the report. I packed my notebook. I drank the last of the coffee, which had been bad for 2 weeks straight and had, in its persistence, earned a kind of respect from me. Calloway found me in the parking area. He was carrying his kit and the unopened, no, reclosed, training manual he'd never opened. He had the expression of a man who has finished a thing and is already in the next thing. He said, "You going to write up the 4-inch shot?" I said, "I wrote up the 11 seconds." He nodded. That same slow nod, recognition, not agreement. "She's going to have a harder time than she should," he said. Not lamenting, which stating it the way you state a weather condition. This is the atmosphere. This is what moves through it. Here's your gear. Proceed accordingly. Yeah, I said. He picked up his bag. He said, "She already knows that." He got in his vehicle. I stood in the parking area with my notebook and my pencil and the full assessment report filed, and vehicle pulling away. The range behind like me already being reset for the next cycle, the next 11 candidates, the next decommissioned structure, the next Tully with his clipboard gavel and his careful silence. I think about what Reyes had said in the dark. With her M4 field stripped in front of her. The after, I'll figure out tomorrow. She'd figured it out in 11 seconds at the bottom of a corridor floor. I clicked my pencil. Once, which I didn't write anything. Some things don't need to be in the notebook. Some, actually, things are just already there. In the walls, in the 4-inch gap, in the particular silence of a range where 11 people have just watched something happen that none of them have a form for yet. I got, I guess, in my vehicle. 6 days later, I got a new assignment notification. New cycle. The request came with a name already attached to the secondary observer slot. The name wasn't mine. The name was Reyes.